They laughed the second she walked onto the tarmac. 4 months of mockery, ignored qualifications, a career quietly buried in paperwork. Nobody expected what happened next. When a pilot's life hung by a thread at 11,000 feet, one voice on the radio changed everything. Watch how she silenced them all, in under a minute. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The tarmac at Hawthorne Air Reserve Base shimmered under the late September sun, heat rising off the concrete in visible waves. Major Elena Reyes stood at the edge of Hangar 3, her flight suit zipped to the collar, her helmet tucked under one arm exactly the way she'd carried it for the past 11 years. She was 36 years old, 5'5", and she had logged more hours in fast jet trainers than half the men who would spend the next 10 minutes laughing at her. She didn't know that yet. Not the specifics. But she knew the sound was coming, because it always came, and she had learned to walk through it the way she walked through turbulence, steady hands, steady breath, eyes forward. The occasion was the base's biannual readiness exercise, a joint drill meant to test how quickly a mixed squadron of Air National Guard and active duty pilots could scramble aircraft in response to a simulated regional threat. Elena had been assigned to the exercise 3 weeks earlier, on paper as a fully qualified fighter pilot with type ratings on the F-16C and, more recently, cross-training hours on the newer F-35A airframe. On paper, she outranked or matched the qualifications of every pilot walking toward the flight line that morning. In practice, she had spent the last 4 months flying a desk. "Well, look who decided to put the suit on today," came the voice from behind her, unmistakably belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Frank Osei, the squadron's flight operations chief. He wasn't technically her commanding officer, that distinction belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, who ran the base and who Elena would not see until later that afternoon, but Osei had appointed himself the unofficial gatekeeper of who got to fly and who got to file paperwork, and for 4 months, Elena had been on the losing end of that arrangement. Osei was 51, built like a man who had spent 30 years believing that broad shoulders and a loud voice were leadership qualities in themselves. He had 2 combat tours in his record and an instructor rating that made him, by regulation, one of the most senior aviators on base. He also had a habit of routing every flight assignment through people he'd flown with before, a closed loop of familiar faces, all of them men, all of them comfortable. "Morning, sir," Elena said, and kept walking. "You headed somewhere, Reyes?" Osei fell into step beside her, and behind him, a knot of junior pilots, Captain Danny Wu, Captain Ray Phelps, and First Lieutenant Priya Anand, slowed their own pace to watch. "Because the sim room's the other direction." "I'm on the roster for the second flight window," Elena said. 10:45. Tail 402. Osei actually laughed at that, a short, disbelieving bark. "Nobody told me Reyes was flying today." "It's been on the board since Tuesday, sir." "Ha." He didn't check the board. He didn't need to, because whether or not her name was there had stopped being the actual question a long time ago. "Well, I guess we'll see how that goes." Wu snorted. Phelps didn't bother hiding his grin. Anand, the only other woman in the group, looked at her boots. It wasn't that any of them said something explicitly cruel. That was the part that made it difficult to name, difficult to report, difficult to even fully explain to her own husband over dinner some nights. It was the tone. It was the laugh that arrived a half-second before anything funny had actually been said. It was the way Osei said "we'll see how that goes," as though her strapping into a 9-figure aircraft were a stunt rather than a job she'd trained a decade to do. Elena had grown up the daughter of a crop duster pilot in the Central Valley, learning to read wind shear off a dirt strip before she learned to parallel park. Her father, Hector, had flown AG planes for 30 years without a single serious incident, and he had taught her, before she was old enough to reach the rudder pedals without a cushion, that an airplane didn't care who was flying it. It only cared whether you understood it. That lesson had planted itself somewhere permanent in her, long before anyone in a flight suit ever laughed at her. She'd gone through the Air Force Academy on a physics scholarship, graduated in the top 5% of her class, and spent 6 years as an instructor pilot at Luke Air Force Base, where cadets who couldn't fly a coordinated turn to save their lives came out the other side able to land in a crosswind that would make most civilian pilots white-knuckle the yoke. She had trained 41 student pilots over those 6 years. 39 of them had gone on to operational squadrons. 2 had washed out for reasons that had nothing to do with her instruction. It was, by any honest measure, one of the better records in the training command that decade. None of it had followed her to Hawthorne in any way that mattered. Records existed on paper. Reputation, it turned out, had to be re-earned in person, in every new room, by every new set of eyes that decided in advance what kind of pilot they were looking at before she'd said a word. Her flight logs weren't a mystery. They were sitting in a filing cabinet 40 feet from where Osei was currently laughing at her. He simply hadn't read them. Or he had, and it hadn't mattered. Elena had stopped trying to guess which was worse a long time ago, because the outcome was identical either way, and she'd learned that dwelling on the distinction cost her more than it ever bought her. By 0900, the exercise briefing was underway in the ready room, a low-ceilinged space with a wall of monitors and a scarred wooden table that had probably seen 3 decades of squadron arguments. Colonel Webb ran the brief himself, laying out the scenario, a simulated incursion along a maritime boundary, requiring a rapid response flight of 2 aircraft to intercept and identify an unknown contact, with a second flight held in reserve. Webb was 62, silver-haired, and famously unsentimental. He read off the primary flight assignment, Wu and Phelps, tail numbers 401 and 403, and then the reserve flight. Reyes, Anand, your reserve. Tail 402 and 404. Stand by at cockpit ready alert. It wasn't nothing. Reserve status meant she'd be strapped in, engines cold, waiting for a scramble order that in 99 exercises out of 100 never came. It was, Elena understood without anyone needing to explain it to her, the exercise equivalent of being handed a folding chair at the edge of the field. She caught Anand's eye across the table. Anand was 28, 2 years out of pilot training, sharp as anything but still new enough to the base's particular culture that she hadn't yet developed the calluses Elena carried. She gave Elena a small, tired half-smile that said I know without either of them having to say it out loud. After the brief, as pilots filed out toward the equipment lockers, Osei caught Elena's arm, not roughly, just enough to make his point land. Reserve's the right call today, Reyes. This is a live-fire adjacent scenario. We want experienced hands forward. I have more hours than Phelps, Elena said quietly. I have more hours than you, in type, over the last 2 years. Hours in a trainer don't mean the same thing as hours in a hot seat, Osei said, and there it was again, the sentence constructed to sound like wisdom while meaning nothing at all, because Elena's hours weren't in a trainer, they were in the exact aircraft sitting on the ramp outside, and both of them knew it. She didn't argue. Arguing had never once worked, in 4 months of trying. She said, "Understood, sir," and walked to her locker, and began the long, familiar process of putting on a flight suit for a jet she wasn't going to fly. What nobody on that ramp knew, because nobody had asked, and Elena had stopped volunteering information that would only be dismissed, was that she had spent the previous 18 months, largely on her own time, working through an advanced systems certification on the F-16's newer digital flight control suite, the same upgrade currently being installed across half of Hawthorne's aircraft, including tail 402 and 403. She'd done it not because anyone required it of her, but because the squadron's maintenance officer, a quiet, overworked master sergeant named Bill Farrow, had mentioned once in the break room that nobody on the flying side really understood the new fly-by-wire logic well enough to troubleshoot it in the air, and it had bothered her enough that she went and fixed the gap in her own knowledge, alone, at night, with manuals spread across her kitchen table while her husband did the dishes. She had never told Osei. There had never seemed to be a point. Information offered to a room that has already decided you're not worth listening to just becomes something else to be laughed at. The exercise scramble came at 1,122 hours, and it did not go according to script. Captain Danny Wu's aircraft, tail 401, had barely reached 10,000 feet on its climb out when the cockpit lit up with a cascade of caution messages, a flight control fault that scrambled his flight display and locked out two of his primary control surfaces. It wasn't a training scenario. The digital flight control computer, the same one Elena had spent her evening studying, had thrown a genuine fault, the kind maintenance had been quietly worried about since the upgrade went in 3 weeks earlier. Hawthorne Tower, Lightning 1, I've got a FLCS caution, control surface degradation, requesting immediate return. Wu's voice crackled over the tower frequency, tighter than the calm, practiced radio voice pilots trained to maintain. In the tower, the room went from routine exercise chatter to controlled urgency in under 3 seconds. Colonel Webb was on the comm immediately. Lightning 1, say your altitude and control status. 11,000, sir, I've got partial roll authority, pitch is sluggish, I'm, a pause, static, the particular silence of a pilot fighting a jet that wasn't answering the way it should, I'm having trouble holding altitude. Feltz, Intail 403, broke off to fly loose formation on Wu, calling out visual references, but there was nothing he could do about a computer fault buried 3 layers deep in flight control software he hadn't been trained on. Nobody in the tower had been trained on it either, not fully, not to the level required to talk a pilot through an active in-flight fault in real time, because the upgrade documentation was 600 pages of dense engineering language that most of the operational pilots had skimmed once during a mandatory briefing and never opened again. Osei was on his feet, radio in hand, and for the first time in 4 months Elena watched him look genuinely, completely lost. Get me someone from the manufacturer rep on the line, he barked at nobody in particular. Get me, somebody who actually knows this system. Master Sergeant Farrow, who had been standing quietly near the back wall monitoring the maintenance feed, said the thing that changed the next 40 minutes of Elena's life. Sir. Major Reyes did the deep certification on the new FLCS logic. She's the only one on this base who's been inside that architecture past the surface level. Osei turned. For a half-second, Elena would remember this half-second for a long time, his face did something complicated, disbelief fighting against the sound of a man's voice cracking over an open radio channel, 11,000 feet up, running out of options. Necessity, it turned out, was faster than pride. Reyes. Get on that comm now. Elena did not gloat. There wasn't room for it, not with a friend's life measured out in altitude and airspeed on a radar screen. She crossed the room in 4 steps, took the headset from Osei's outstretched hand, and keyed the mic with the same steady voice she used with panicking cadets a decade earlier. Lightning 1, this is Reyes. I've got you. Talk to me, what's your caution page showing, top to bottom, exactly as it's written? Wu read it off, breath ragged. Elena closed her eyes for half a second, running the fault tree she built for herself on her kitchen table 8 months ago, the one nobody had asked her to build. Okay. That's a secondary actuator dropout on your left stabilator, not a full FLCS failure, the computer's compensating wrong because it thinks you've lost more authority than you actually have. I need you to manually reset the flight control computer using the reset switch, guard cover on your left console, 2nd row. Do not touch the trim while you do it. Copy, resetting, a pause that stretched 2 full seconds too long. Reyes, I've got a partial recovery. Rolls coming back. Pitch is still sluggish. That's expected for the next 90 seconds while it recalibrates. Hold your altitude, don't fight the stick, let the computer walk itself back. I want gentle inputs only. You are not going to lose this aircraft, Danny. Talk to me every 15 seconds. Behind her, Osei had gone very quiet, watching the radar return that represented tail 401 drift slightly on the screen, then steady. Webb stood with his arms crossed, saying nothing, letting her work without interruption, the single most useful thing a commander could do in that moment, and Elena registered, even through her own focus, that he understood it. 15 seconds, Wu reported, voice tighter than before. Still sluggish on pitch. I'm fighting it a little, Reyes, it doesn't want to answer. Don't fight it. That's the mistake that makes this worse. The computer is walking itself through a self-test right now, and if you override it with manual input it'll think the fault's still active and restart the whole cycle. I need you to trust the reset. I know that's hard at 11,000 feet. Breathe. You've got altitude to work with. You are not falling out of the sky, Danny, you are flying a jet that is temporarily annoyed with itself. It was, in retrospect, an odd thing to say over an open emergency channel, and later Wu would tell people it was the exact thing that let him unclench his hands on the stick. The small, deliberate humor, dropped at precisely the moment his mind needed something other than fear to hold on to. Copy, he said, and his voice had leveled out. Easing off. Another 30 seconds passed. Elena watched the digital clock on the tower wall the way she used to watch it during check rides, aware of every second without letting the awareness show in her voice. Pitch is coming back, Wu said. Reyes, I've got authority. I've got the jet. Good. Bring your nose up 2 degrees, gently, and tell me what your trim indicator's showing. He read it off. Elena ran the number against the fault tree in her head, confirmed it matched the recovery pattern she'd mapped out on her kitchen table 8 months earlier, and allowed herself, for the first time since the radio call came in, something close to relief. For the next 6 minutes, the tower fell almost completely silent except for Elena's voice, calm, specific, unhurried, walking a frightened pilot through a fault that no manual on base fully explained, using knowledge she had built entirely on her own time, for no reward anyone had promised her, because a problem had bothered her and she hadn't been able to leave it alone. Pitch authorities back, Wu finally reported, and Elena could hear something loosen in his voice. I've got full control. Requesting vectors for landing. Copy, Lightning 1. You're doing great. Bring her home. Tail 401 touched down 9 minutes later, hard but controlled, trailing a haze of tire smoke that the fire crews chased down the runway out of pure procedure rather than necessity. Wu climbed out of the cockpit on legs that weren't entirely steady, pulled off his helmet, and stood on the tarmac for a long moment just breathing. In the tower, nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Colonel Webb was the first to speak, and what he said wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Reyes. Pharaoh. My office. Now. Osei, you too. The debrief that followed was short and largely one-sided. Webb wanted to know exactly what had happened to the flight control computer, exactly how Elena had known the fix, and exactly why the squadron's official emergency procedures hadn't included it. Because the manual's wrong, Elena said simply. Or incomplete. The manufacturer's fault isolation logic assumes a full FLCS failure triggers the same warning as a single actuator dropout. It doesn't. I found the discrepancy in March, when I went through the architecture on my own. I flagged it to maintenance. She glanced at Pharaoh. It went into a work order queue. I don't think it ever made it up to ops. Webb turned to Osei. Osei, to his credit, and Elena would give him this much later, when she was less shaken and more able to be fair, didn't try to deflect it. It didn't, he said. I didn't push it through. I didn't think, he stopped. You didn't think it mattered, Webb finished for him, because you didn't think she mattered enough to have found something real. Nobody answered that, because there wasn't an answer that didn't confirm it. Word travels fast on a small base, faster than any official report, and by the time Elena walked out to the flight line an hour later, because the exercise, astonishingly, was still scheduled to continue, and Reserve Flight 402 was still, technically, hers to fly, the atmosphere on the tarmac had shifted in a way she could feel before anyone said a word. Wu was standing by the maintenance shed, still in his flight suit, drinking water like a man rehydrating after a fever. When he saw her, he set the bottle down and crossed the ramp toward her, and for a second Elena genuinely didn't know what he was going to say. You talked me down, he said. I mean that literally. I was about 4 seconds from ejecting over open water because I thought I'd lost the jet completely, and you talked me down in about 90 seconds flat. He shook his head. I've flown with you for 2 years and I didn't know any of that. Nobody told me. Nobody asked, Elena said, and it came out more honest than she meant it to. Phelps, who arrived a moment later, didn't say much, just gave a short nod, the kind of acknowledgement that from a man like Phelps counted as a genuine apology, and Elena understood it as one. Anand caught up to her at the aircraft steps, practically vibrating. That was the single most impressive thing I've ever heard on a radio, she said. You didn't even sound stressed. I was terrified, Elena admitted, quiet enough that only Anand heard it. You just don't let it into your voice. Not while someone's listening to you for the answer. It was, in its way, the first real lesson she'd given anyone on that base in 4 months, and it landed harder than anything a training slide could have taught. The exercise resumed at 1,310 hours, and Colonel Webb made a decision that rewired the rest of the day, and arguably the rest of Elena's assignment at Hawthorne. He scrubbed the reserve designation and moved Elena into the primary flight, replacing Phelps's wingman slot, on the grounds, stated plainly, in front of the full squadron, that the base had just watched, in real time, exactly what kind of pilot it had been keeping on the ground. Reyes, you're flying lead on the second intercept run. Tail 402. Wheels up in 20. There was no laughter this time. There was, instead, a strange and total quiet as Elena walked toward tail 402 in her flight suit, helmet under her arm, the same way she had walked that morning past a knot of men who found her funny. Osei was standing near the hangar doors as she passed. He didn't try to stop her, didn't try to make a joke, didn't try to reclaim any ground. He just said, low enough that it wasn't for anyone else's benefit, that was good work, Reyes. Damn good work. It wasn't an apology. Elena understood that men like Osei rarely offered those cleanly, and that 4 months of dismissiveness didn't dissolve into one sentence on a hot tarmac. But it was something, and she took it for what it was, a first step, not a resolution. She climbed the ladder to the cockpit alone, the way she had 100 times before in trainers and simulators and the quiet hours of her own study, strapped in with the practiced economy of someone who had done this so many times. The motions lived in her hands rather than her mind, and ran her pre-start checks against a silence on the ramp that felt entirely different from the silence that morning. Faro, standing ground crew for her aircraft, gave her the thumbs up from below. Clear to start, Major. Elena reached up, flipped the engine master switch, and pressed the ignition. The turbine caught with a low, building whine that climbed into a full-throated roar, the compressor blades spinning up to a blur, heat shimmer rolling back off the exhaust in visible waves across the tarmac. It was a sound Elena had heard 1,000 times, in 1,000 different jets, and it had never once stopped meaning something to her, the particular, physical proof that 11 years of studying, training, and refusing to quit had built into something that could, quite literally, fly. On the ramp, the pilots who had laughed that morning stood and watched her taxi out, and for the first time in 4 months, nobody was laughing at all. The intercept run itself was almost anticlimactic by comparison, a clean, technically flawless execution of exactly the kind of mission Elena had spent a career preparing for. She and Phelps located and identified the simulated contact within 90 seconds of their assigned window, held formation through a tight turning intercept that would have looked, from the ground, like something out of an airshow, and returned to base with fuel and margin to spare. But it wasn't really the flight that changed things. It was the 40 minutes before it, the voice on the radio, steady when it mattered most, built from knowledge nobody had asked her to acquire and offered anyway, because that was who Elena Reyes had always been, whether or not anyone on that base had bothered to notice. That evening, Colonel Webb called a squadron meeting, unusual for a Friday, and stood at the front of the ready room with none of his usual brevity. I've been running this base for 6 years, he said, and I like to think I know when something's broken before it costs me a pilot. Today it almost cost me one anyway, and the only reason it didn't is that one officer on this base took it upon herself, on her own time, to understand a system the rest of us treated as somebody else's problem. He looked around the room, letting the silence sit. Major Reyes is being submitted for a commendation. She is also, effective Monday, taking over the squadron's flight systems training program, because apparently the rest of us have some catching up to do. There was a pause, and then, quiet at first, then less quiet, the room began to applaud. Wu started it. Anand followed. Even Feltz, arms crossed, nodded along. Osei clapped last, and slower than the others, but he clapped. Elena sat in the third row, helmet still resting on her knee from the debrief, and let herself, finally, exhale. 6 weeks later, Elena stood at the same edge of Hangar 3 where the story had started, watching a new group of junior pilots, 3 of them, fresh off training pipeline assignments, one of them a young woman named Sofia Castillo who reminded Elena uncomfortably of herself a decade earlier, all sharp edges and quiet determination, walk toward the same jets that had once been walked toward without her. Osei approached, not with the old swagger but with something closer to genuine collegiality, a shift that had taken weeks of small, deliberate corrections on his part that Elena had noticed and, cautiously, begun to credit. "Castillo's good," he said. "Reminds me of somebody." "Careful," Elena said, "or I'll put her through the same systems cert I did. She'll be running your training program in 2 years." Osei laughed, a real one this time, not the kind that arrived a half-second before anything funny had actually been said. "Wouldn't be the worst thing that ever happened to this squadron." Elena watched Castillo climb into her cockpit, watched the younger woman's hands move through the pre-start checklist with careful precision, watched the same tarmac that had once held nothing but laughter now hold something closer to respect, earned the only way it had ever really been available to earn, not through permission granted, but through competence that could no longer be ignored. The engine caught. The whine built into a roar. And nobody on that ramp so much as smiled the wrong way. Elena Reyes turned back toward the hangar, helmet under her arm, and walked inside to prepare for her own flight, not because anyone had finally decided to let her, but because she had never, not once in 11 years, stopped being exactly what the job required. That night, after her flight, Elena sat at her kitchen table the way she had 100 nights before, except this time the manuals stacked in front of her weren't secret homework nobody had asked for. They were the working drafts of the new systems training curriculum, official now, with her name on the cover page and a signature line waiting for Colonel Webb's approval. Her husband, Marcus, set a cup of coffee down beside her elbow without being asked, the way he always did on nights when he could tell she was somewhere else entirely, still running fault trees in her head. "You okay?" he asked. "I keep thinking about how close it was," she admitted. "Not the jet. Danny." If Pharaoh hadn't spoken up. If Osei had waited even another minute to hand me that headset out of pride. She turned the coffee cup slowly in her hands. 18 months of studying something nobody asked me to study, and it almost didn't matter, because the room almost didn't let it matter in time. "But it did," Marcus said. "This time." She looked up at him. "That's the part that bothers me. It shouldn't take an emergency for competence to get heard. It shouldn't take somebody almost dying." He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't a clean one, and Elena didn't expect him to have one. Some truths just needed to be said out loud to someone who would listen without trying to fix them. The following Monday, her first session of the new flight systems training program drew 14 pilots, more than double what Webb had projected. Wu sat in the front row and took notes like a man determined never again to be caught not knowing something that could save his life. Feltz sat near the back, arms crossed at first, then slowly leaning forward as Elena worked through the fault tree diagrams she'd built alone, months earlier, for an audience of no one. Even Osei attended, sliding into a seat near the door 10 minutes late, staying for the full 90 minutes without a single interruption, which, for a man who had spent 4 months treating her presence on the flight line as a running joke, was its own kind of apology. 6 weeks later, at the edge of Hangar 3, Elena watched Sofia Castillo's engine catch and roar to life, and thought about how differently that sound had felt on the first morning of the story, the sound of a jet she wasn't being allowed to fly, walked toward through a wall of laughter that had taken every ounce of her discipline not to answer. Now the sound meant something else entirely. It meant a base that had finally, however reluctantly, learned to listen before it decided who belonged in the cockpit, and a young pilot climbing into her jet knowing that if something went wrong at 10,000 feet, there would be a voice on the radio steady enough to bring her home. Elena Reyes turned back toward the hangar one last time, helmet under her arm, and walked inside, not as a lesson the base had needed to learn, but simply as who she had always been, the pilot who studied the system nobody else wanted to understand, who spoke calmly when it mattered most, and who never once needed anyone's permission to be exactly that good.